And here we go, French fries, boats, and what's happening in the spot market.
Welcome to the HPLS podcast. Live, relevant, and high performance information, conversations, and education weekly.
Dean, my man, when you told me that we're going to be talking French fries today, I was all over it like a fat kid on a Smartie, buddy. I'm all about the fries and gravy and cheese and all that kind of stuff that's no good for you, but that I just love tremendously. And even though I have a really tough time eating fries, I still love them when they're caked in diet gravy because it's got to be diet French fries with diet gravy.
Yeah. My wife dips them in ice cream in the soft serve at McDonald's. She likes the sweet and sour or sweet and salty combination.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've actually heard a lot of people like that. And what I've seen recently is like poutine that has gone above and beyond just gravy and cheese. Right now it's like chicken in it and shawarma poutine and Indian buttered chicken poutine and all these kind of things. And I'm like, man, fries do go with almost everything.
Well, McDonald's Japan have released fries with chocolate flavoring, chocolate sauce on top. Okay.
See, now you're kind of talking, my language, where you get a little bit of the chocolate in, a little of the fries, everything that's not good for you, but you still love it anyway. So while I smell fries now for some reason, while we're on the topic, let's talk about fries, because I know we got a lot of things to talk about the Port of Baltimore.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at this and saying to myself, how on earth does that happen, Dean? And I don't even know. Like, when you start looking at some of the pictures from this ship that hit the bridge in Baltimore, I start questioning a lot of things. I've seen brain farts before, but I don't know, man. But let's go. I'll let you take it.
Yeah, one of the things we had in our weekly market update this week was a piece on the French fry capital, self-proclaimed, I think, of the world, although that may well be justified. We see a lot of good refrigerated volume coming out of the Pacific Northwest, and that kind of includes Idaho on the eastern side. For truckload carriers, Idaho remains the largest producer of fresh potatoes, followed by Colorado and Wisconsin. Canada and Michigan also get in on the act with a significant amount of volume. But the production of French fries is quite different, though. A lot of it comes out of the Pendleton freight market. It's in Othello, Washington, regarded as the French fry capital of the world. There's 3 processing plants there. I think two are owned by Simplot, one's McCain's, and maybe it's the other way around. They produce about 35,000 truckloads of refrigerated French fries each year. I know that the Cavendish Farms also produce a lot of French fries out of Presque Isle, Maine, up on the eastern coast, up on the top of Maine on the Canadian border. Huge potato growing region up there. So, we've seen that some pretty good volume come out of those markets. And today, coming out of the Pendleton market, I'm just going to load up the data here now and give you a sense of what the freight rates look like coming out of there. It's a significant part of the world, not just because produce season runs all year round up there. What you see over there is a lot of good southbound freight for refrigerated carriers that really starts... you can almost start in Lent when a lot of seafood comes in, and then you start to get over into, there's the fall produce season starts off sort of later in the year. You see really good volumes across the summer. In the refrigerated market right now, we're seeing higher volumes year over year, not significant, but enough to keep carriers moving. Rates are up, Dan, about 9%. They're close to $2 a mile out of this area right now. So pretty lucrative market. Yeah, I think capacity is fairly tight. Year over year produce volumes up, maybe understated. It's a lot higher. It's about 30% year over year. You can't attribute all that directly to French fries, but the point is that Pendleton includes a lot of big produce growing areas in Yakima and the Columbia River Basin. So it's a really strong reefer market. So this week we just had a good piece about that particular market and how much volume's coming out of there. It's pretty interesting, I think, to track this kind of freight volumes, because potatoes are one of those all year round commodities that they harvest in the latter part of the year and then ship all year round. And of course, the big area up in your part of the world is Prince Edward Island. It's one of the biggest provinces for potatoes. We see bulk transport's the big carrier that comes out of there, and they bring a lot of volume down here. A lot of it's fresh, a lot of fresh potatoes, but you also see a lot of frozen run south. So that's the potato story. It just fits nicely into this incredible demand we're seeing for refrigerated trucks in the Pacific Northwest. It's not enough to prop up the entire market. I think and neither is any of the produce markets at the moment, because we're not in peak season yet where capacity starts to tighten. Rates are still fairly flat, although for this week across the board, reefer, dry van and flatbed rates did start to go up after being flat for almost a month. So I think that's significant. 1 week doesn't make a trend, but it really feels like the market is turning. There was a real sense of that. We think this capacity has exited in a meaningful way, and there is that seasonal impact on the freight market where demand starts to pick up, where, and this is kind of a segue into the Baltimore story, this is peak import season for machinery. Think John Deere, Kubota, Caterpillar, Case New Holland, Class hay balers, wood chippers, mulch turners. You think about anything that comes in, Baltimore is the largest port in the country for roll-on, roll-off machinery, ag equipment, farm equipment, cranes, forklifts, anything that can be rolled on or off, not containerized. Baltimore's only the 13th largest port for import containers, right? But it's the largest for RoRo, roll on, roll off. If you look at all the pounds that come in, just pounds of imports, automobiles are about 75%. It's our biggest port, it's the biggest auto port in the country. So, so there's some impacts in the market that are going to have some, I think, impact sort of in the middle of the country. I think we're in planting season, right? It's nursery season, planting season. We're starting to get into the season where volumes increase as the temperatures warm, and it leads into produce season. So that's kind of a long way of explaining what seasonality is doing here at the end of March. We were starting to see things warm up and freight volumes start to increase, which starts to lift spot rates. So all that seems to be lining up now, which is interesting because we're 4 years out from when the pandemic started, and we're starting to see a little bit of that seasonality return on time, which is the key word, on time words.
And I noticed too that, we're just about to head into Q2. And, we were talking last year where the thought process originally was starting of Q2, things were going to start turning.
Yeah,
and then, through the year and seeing things not happen, it was like, well, maybe it'll be Q3 and everything. But I can remember vividly when I first got back from being sick, we were talking about like Q2, expect some things to start really shifting in Q2. And it's interesting, Dean, because more often than not, if any one of you are watching and listening, if you go back through data day, you're pretty bang on, Dean, with timelines. And
right.
I think it's at the point where I'm going to start getting you to do my lottery picks, because for the most part, you're above as opposed to below, if that makes sense.
Well, I didn't win Mega Millions last night, so you have to scratch me.
Well, you're here today. Of course you didn't win.
Exactly. But, Dan,
and behind you is the regular view instead of a beach view with your own hut on the water in Thailand somewhere. So yeah, and I'm not with you, so I know you didn't win.
Exactly. Oh, no, I'd still be here. No, I'd still be here. I can
dial in Thailand somewhere for a quick vacation where you don't necessarily have to work.
I would call in anyway. If I can dial in from McDonald's on the Hume Highway in Australia, mooching off their terrible internet.
Yeah, you can dial in from Thailand for sure. Yeah.
So it's interesting. We theorized that this would be the time of the year that if anything was going to happen, it would, because of two things. One is what you just described, the seasonality and the lift in demand, but two, the exodus of capacity that's leaving the market. And while we're chatting here, I'll quickly pull up the latest numbers, because I think they're very interesting when it comes to the number of carriers exiting the market. that we see each month, because we're the 27th of the month. So we've still got a couple of days of processing of carrier revocations to go. But Dan, the numbers so far, and they're trending much lower. I'll tell you what the numbers are. We had, wait till my system loads here. We had in February. So in February, it's loading up March. So
January was a massive exodus.
Yeah.
So in February, I know it slowed down a bit. I think we were in the neighborhood of 2,300 as opposed to 8,000 in January, if I remember correctly.
So 9,000 exits in January, and then we had 8,000 in February, and so far we've got 6,500. So
in March.
Yeah, so far, a few days to go, right? There's a few days of processing to go. So that if you look at the trend line, the black line, we're trending back up towards positive territory. But here's the important number in terms of net capacity in this 5% of the industry that always changes their authority status, that moves the capacity needle across the market. In January, we had a net loss of 2,600. In February, we had a net loss of 1,400. So far, our net loss is only 500.
Yeah. So, wow, what a massive correction.
So it's squeezing like this. There's fewer carriers joining, reactivating, and fewer leaving. And we're really trending back towards the long-term trend from 2013 all the way through to when the pandemic started in terms of the adds and subtractions each month. So just for those listening, this is these numbers we talk about here. The 95% of carriers don't change their operating status each month, but there's 5% where 80% plus hit the spot market. So all the carriers that move their status each month, they come into the industry primarily in the spot market. And it's those carriers that leave that moves the needle. Because if most of your capacity that joins and leaves is in the spot market, it has a far bigger impact on the spot market because it's only 15% of all the freight. Not much moves in the contract market unless a massive truckload carrier went out of business, right?
Yes.
When we talk about the spot market leading the contract market, it's the movement of this capacity each month that starts to move the overall needle. And we're just starting to see spot rates inch up ever so slowly. So going back to where we were 5 minutes ago, this is exactly when we'd expect rates to start moving up. Demand will improve, but I don't know that it'll improve along the lines of normal years because we've got a fairly soft freight economy and interest rates still haven't come down. So there's a few things there. And the question we've been getting is, will the bridge collapse in Baltimore move the needle? And nationally, I don't think it will, right? It's not a massive freight market impact like the pandemic was, right, where it affected the entire freight market or the whole country. This will be very regionalized and it'll be impacting, people for sure. I mean, it's worth talking about the geography, Dan. Why Baltimore, right? So why would you export out of Baltimore? I'll give you some stats. Baltimore is the largest inland port on the East Coast, right? So it's the largest port. It's got a third of the US population within 500-mile radius, a third of the US population. So
where would they divert to?
Norfolk, close by.
Okay.
Wilmington, Philly, maybe. So Ro-Ro's a little bit different, right? Because it's the biggest auto port. Most of the volume that comes in there on Ro-Ro is automobiles, farm machinery, tractors. If you can't get in there, Brunswick becomes another category. I think that's about 600 miles south, so that adds a lot of transit time. But Ro-Ro could go to maybe Philadelphia, maybe Norfolk, Wilmington, Savannah down the East Coast. So those diversions will happen there. So if you think about
until they get this figured out, it could cause major challenges in all of those ports that aren't necessarily set up to handle the increased volume that would normally have come from Baltimore, right? So you're talking dray, you're talking OTR, you're talking warehouses, you're talking staging, you're talking, transloading containers. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that can start happening in those regional markets, which could then also turn some of the truckload markets, because if something was normally coming out of Baltimore, now it's coming out of Philly.
Right.
it's
So
replacing equipment, right?
yeah, so they're not, Baltimore is a top 20 freight market, but it's very high on the flatbed market. It's a top 5 flatbed market. And because March is peak import season for farm machinery, construction machinery, because we're in the season of building and growing and planting, there will be a direct impact on some regional markets, at that
Hmm.
3-digit zip code level. I don't think it'll be enough to move the national needle in a meaningful way, but you want to bet rates in Baltimore or other markets nearby will start to move as capacity
Oh,
has to be relocated. I mean, think
yeah.
auto hauling. If 75% of the imports, it's our largest auto port in the country for imports and exports. Think about the impact on auto haulers and the cost of new cars. Just when cars are coming down and dealers have
Yeah.
an excess of inventory, suddenly we have a massive disruption to the supply chain of automotive
Hmm.
parts and new vehicles. So I think there's going to be some impact on us there. But I think from our biggest impact, I think, notwithstanding the fact it's a big coal export and sugar import. Domino's Sugars say they've got 8 weeks of supply of sugar, so there's no problems there. But I think the biggest impact, Dan, is in planting season. Think John Deere in Quad Cities, Davenport, Iowa. Think Caterpillar just 100 miles south in the Midwest. So Illinois, Iowa. Think about the planting season and the Midwest corn planting belt, right? This is peak farm machinery, and those trucks, it's a direct line to that particular part
Hmm.
of the world. It's a straight shot to out into the Midwest for all of those, all that farm machinery. Think about Caterpillar, John Deere, Class, all the hay balers, Vermeer that make all the hay balers and the wood chippers. All of that imports comes into Baltimore, and of course they've got exports going out of Baltimore also on the same Ro-Ro ships. I think that's where we'll see some impact because March is the month. Now we are 3/4
Yeah.
of the way through the month. So I don't know how much impact there will be, but the fact that March is peak import season for farm and construction machinery, I think there'll be an impact for sure. Now, to what degree we don't know because there's a lot of slack in the supply chain. Demand is soft, right? So, and I'll use the analogy of when the Red Sea crisis happened and ships had to take 9 to 12 days to go around the Cape of Good Hope, right? There was already an excess of ocean capacity in the market, and that extra time was absorbed by the excess capacity.
Yeah.
The same
So you
thing,
didn't really feel a huge pinch on
no.
rates or numbers or anything. Yeah.
So think about this: to go when you take off out the bridge in Baltimore, you can go 695 north to 85 to 95 and 895 south. It adds another half an hour in off-peak time, and maybe about 10 to 12 miles for a run to Atlanta. You can't just go south straight across the bridge. Hazmat carriers will have to go all the way around the 695 belt because they can't go across the bridge south. So
Mhm.
northbound carriers won't have a problem getting out of, the Amazon fulfillment center at Sparrows Point or the Home Depot or the Floor and Decor port area near the port. But southbound loads will have an issue. They'll have more time. So it's not a massive disruption. There will be a disruption for like coal imports in particular because it's the second biggest port for coal. They're going to have to find on-dock storage, position rail cars, somehow get it to Norfolk, which is the biggest coal export. And you can see on marine traffic, all of the big bulkers, the bulk coal export ships starting to bunch up. Right now on marine traffic, if you look at the ships at anchor, one's a car carrier and the other 13 are bulkers, which do sugar and coal and things like that. So not a massive impact. You want to bet that the 100 or so vessels that were due in Baltimore in the next couple of weeks have got to find a new home. And that will
Yeah.
mean more delays for dray carriers, any carrier picking up containers. There'll be delays to the transloading location for those containers. And then there'll be delays, for a little while. I think this will take a month or so to work its way through the freight market and everybody to find a new home for their imports and exports while this port is while they try to reopen the port, which is going to be quite a few months, I think, Dan. I think this is a pretty big deal.
I was just going to ask you that because there's two things that I look at. I look at one is the dray carriers in Baltimore.
Yep.
If these ships aren't hitting the port anymore, are in a real tough spot because of
Yeah.
with the freight market, how it's been with the lack of productivity for most companies, and now this, it's kind of like just kick me while I'm down even harder. But
Right.
then the second thing I started thinking about is when you look at that bridge, and for all of you actually watching live today, like that bridge is totally destroyed.
Oh yeah.
Um, and for any of you on listening to this afterwards on the actual podcast, go Google Baltimore Bridge ship, and you'll see the images.
Mm.
Like how long? Like I'm curious to see how long it will take to
Right.
build that bridge back up, because there's not only just building it, there's getting rid of all the old steel now that's probably no good, all twisted,
Right.
getting that all out of the ocean so it doesn't contaminate, cleaning that whole area up, and then rebuilding it. And it doesn't get built overnight. Um,
Well, Dan, the similar bridge, I read something on Wall Street Journal this morning. Remember that bridge that collapsed in Italy, in Ponte
yes.
Morandi in 2018? It took 2 years to rebuild that. This bridge took 5. This similar, very similar bridge, not as long, but very similar construction. This bridge in 1977 took 5 years to build, the Francis Key Bridge. So it took 5 years back in 1977. You're looking, I think, here at least 2 years to rebuild that bridge. But given the fact that the federal government are going to pay for the entire cost out of infrastructure funds, I presume, and the importance of this, we may see it happen even quicker. The Army Corps of Engineers may be able to rig up something temporary. I don't know. They're fairly creative, so we'll have to wait and see there. But rest assured, that port closure, there's 2 ships stuck in port. One's a bulk ship. I think the other was a car carrier, or maybe they were 2 bulkers. Not a lot of ships stuck in port. So, yeah, the ripple effects of this are going to be felt for a long time, both on the economy and on the import side and the auto side.
And I would assume, Dean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but to reopen the port, it's just a matter of cleaning up that bridge so ships can come through.
Well,
Meaning the ships will still be, do you think that they'll still push the ships through when the bridge is being built, or are they just going to shut
oh
that
yeah,
entire piece
no,
down to build it?
they'll do it where they come from both sides, and the ships will be able to pass through. But the biggest issue is the debris is part of an ongoing NTSB investigation, right? So that
Yeah,
even
so
though
they
they're
got to
going
do
to
the investigation before they start cleaning up, and
every
then da 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 da.
every scrap of steel is part of the investigation. So they've got to get the big lifting barges in. That's going to take a couple of days. They've got to lift it out. It's got to be part of the evidence chain. And those big ships need about 50 feet of draft. It's not a whole lot deeper where that debris is sitting. So it's one of the deepest ports on the East Coast. Think Ever Given, right? The Ever Given pulls about 50 feet of draft. That's why Wilmington dreads their harbour, so they could bring in the big, massive 20,000 TEU container ships. So a lot of the East Coast ports have dug their ports deeper to bring in the bigger ships to compete with the West Coast. So it's a deep harbour port, and that debris is now sitting, and of course, so are the deceased, sitting at the bottom of the harbour, presumably.
Yeah.
So they can't just race in and magically cut up that steel and move it away, but they will do their best to try and open port traffic as soon as they can to get ships in and out. So that's going to be the
Didn't
whole.
even, I feel horrible. I didn't even comprehend the amount of deceased. Do they know what the death toll is yet?
They've said 6, and
That's it. Oh,
when you
wow.
look at
That's
so
great.
they were able, the Mayday call from the ship when it lost power coming out of the port enabled them to close the bridge either end. There were 2 cars that just made it across in the nick of time. But when you look at the flashing lights, the 6 workers that were on top of the bridge, you could see the flashing lights flashing. As the bridge came down, they slid down into the water. So presumably that's where the fatalities came from, where the road workers repairing potholes on top of the bridge. That's the real tragedy here, is they couldn't get them off quick enough. And when you think about it, Dan, big ships coming under that bridge are a normal occurrence at night. So it's not like you would have been sitting there working. It's just another night at 1:30 in the morning. Everyone's kind of tired, and it's kind of fog when you work at night. You don't necessarily process things that quickly. But this happened, I think, pretty quickly and got out of control. They tried to drop anchor to steer it to the left. It went to the right. It's just a tragic sequence of events. But can you imagine if this was at 1 o'clock in the day? Right? Imagine those big ships are leaving port at all hours of the day and night. So it's a tragedy of immeasurable, levels. But and we're sitting here talking about the freight market, but there's a lot of human suffering going on right now, especially the families that have to wait all day to hear if their loved ones had survived or not. And of course, as we know now, they didn't. So that's
Yeah, that's sad. That's sad.
so Baltimore. I think if we sort of bring it back to where our focus is in the market, I think we'll see some impacts in the farm machinery market. I think we'll definitely see some impact in the automotive market, Dan. I think that's going to be where we see the biggest impact, because if that's where most of our BMWs, Mercedes-Benz, VWs, Kias, come into the United States on the East Coast, you want to bet that's going to cause some issues. Now, to what extent, we don't know, because we know that dealers had plenty of inventory. That's why they've been, prices are coming down on the used side. So maybe this turns things around. I don't know. We're going to have to just wait. We're only 2 days out from this happening.
Yeah. So next week, would we? You think you'd have numbers by next week as to what the final numbers were in March? So I'm looking forward to that, because, sitting here with 3 days left with 500 carriers leaving versus exiting versus entering, like that to me is a really good sign, and I'm excited to see what this sign is going to bring for the freight markets moving forward.
Well, Dan, this is 15 months of net capacity loss. So for 15 months, we were losing about 2,500 interstate carriers a month. That was the net loss. Normally, it sits just above zero. The average, if I had to average it, I would say to you, it's probably in the range of a net gain of about 1,000 carriers a month is the net going back 12 years. So we're heading back into positive territory, which again fits with all of what we hear in the market from carriers, and that is that there's a sense that there's light at the end of the tunnel. That's what we heard at Mid-America Truck Show last week, and that is that there are fewer trucks in the market. Things are starting to change, and we feel a little bit better about things. So it looks like the exodus of capacity is happened and is slowing right down. And the other thing we found was that there were a lot of carriers that were just hanging in there because they knew things would turn around. And of course, you can only hang in there if you know your operating costs and you're a pretty savvy operator. So that's what we heard last week.
And you're very aware as to how long you can hang in for before it becomes mission critical, right? And I'm speaking to a lot of people over the last little while, looking at freight markets and selling and brokers and everybody's saying it's tough out there. Like it's a bloodbath.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting because the average that I'm speaking to people and just asking, like what's happening with numbers. I mean, we're talking 30 to 55% is the range that I'm getting, where companies are saying we're like 30 to 55% less profitable than we were. And sales are down 55, 60%. One company I spoke with last week, they were down 65% in sales. And I was like, wow. And he says, yeah, and you know what he figured what one of the issues is salespeople freight was coming in. So they stopped doing what they would normally do. And they thought it was relationships, but in the end it wasn't. It was just a need, a need for a truck. Do you have a truck? I'll give you business. And then as soon as the market flipped, that need wasn't there. And it's interesting. And I mean, I'm going to get a pulse of more people this week and through next week. But one owner said something to me. He said, Dan, he said, I understand now. He goes, when these things were happening and my team was making a ton of money, because I never thought about it.
Right.
He said, but now my first thought is, yes, shippers were using us, but the whole time they were using us, they were saying these guys are ripping me off. Because he's called these customers.
Yeah.
And he said, we're no longer doing business. And they said, no, I understand, but I needed you to move freight for me. But I felt your prices were just high because I had to pay it. So it really gave me a bad taste in my mouth. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He says, I don't know how many people are calling customers that they used to work with. He said, but I'm calling them and asking them straightforward questions. And he goes, and the majority, he goes, over 85% of the ones I've called have said the same thing. Like, I felt like I was taken advantage of. So I I needed to get done what I needed to get done. So I used you. You were kind of this necessary evil at the time. But these suppliers that I'm still working with right now feel that they treated me better than just, okay, well, you're calling me, the price is now 12% higher. And, Dean, this goes back to things I seen in the market in 2018 into 19. Like in the conversations with customers in 2018, our customers that I was dealing with, we had a 4.6%, so call it a 5% increase in freight rates. The majority of people saw 30, 40, 50, 100% increase in rates. And I remember talking to a customer, and this will always stick with me, because I said, what was one of the big things that solidified my relationship with you? And he said, Dan, when times got tough, you didn't jack the numbers up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting because that's not what happened.
Right.
And as well as I do, Dean, but prices skyrocketed because of ELDs. Okay. How much of that was actual prices skyrocketing, and how much of it was people taking advantage of the market? Right. Yep. And I look at it, and if you speak to a lot of the larger carriers, they've been on ELDs, both Canadian and US, for almost 2 years prior.
Oh, Dan, right? 2017. 2007, they were on ELDs. It wasn't called ELD, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so you look at it and you say, okay, so, and I know the majority of our market, 70+% of the market is made up of small carriers, which maybe we're waiting till the last minute to spend the money on ELD to make sure that it was actually going to be, stamped in concrete and da-da-da. But the way the market flipped instantly, customers took that as, you're all scammers, you're taking advantage of a situation. And I think that perception carried forward into COVID. And for those suppliers, those brokers, and those carriers during the COVID days, when they just were like, well, this is what it is, this is the price, this is what it is.
Right.
I think at that point, we as an industry lost the loyalty of a lot of customers. And specific people that would have specific conversations with their customers are the ones that are winning now. And so I honestly think it's a learning lesson for everyone who decided to jack numbers up just because. And I do hope, I doubt it, but I do hope in the future, because it will happen again. If we're going to climb out of this freight market, it's going to go up, Dean, and what's going to happen? It's going to drop. Like, come on, we know the cycle. We know the roller coaster that is the logistics industry. And so my message to all of you out there is, keep it real, keep it have integrity, and don't just look at a paycheck. Because if you were during COVID just looking at a paycheck, charging more than you needed to, and now you're suffering, in my belief, that's karma, because your customers realize you were just in it for you, not them.
Right. So Dan, I think there's a couple of things. I'm just looking at numbers here of private fleets. So I was talking to Bill Cassidy at Journal of Commerce yesterday. He was talking about the growth in private fleets. And I said pretty much that. He said, because growing your private fleet doesn't make sense when spot rates are low, when rates are low, because you can buy cheaper on the open market, right? But I said to him, well, if I was a shipper and I'd been worked over during the pandemic, I would find it cheaper to buy 100 trucks than play the spot market volatility in the next 2 or 3 years, because I can control cost and service by increasing the size of my private fleet, which decreases the pie in the spot market overall. Now, on top of that, you've got high levels of routing guide compliance. Right, so if you think about where is my action going to come from, like the volatility in the market to move freight, this market cycle, we may see less of it because of all the things you've just discussed, but because there's so much capacity on the large truckload carrier side, they're accepting most of the loads that shippers are offering, and very few of it's falling out into the spot market for the non-asset 3PL side of it to be creative with. So there's all of these things are playing. I think that's one of the really good points you make, that this is the long-term effect of what the pandemic has done with shippers in particular. They have absolutely said, we had to pay 10x during the pandemic to move freight. Is it cheaper? Is it a long-term cheaper play for us to double the size of our private fleet? And I think the answer is
100%.
absolutely.
Yeah, and Dean, if we look at, and I honestly believe, hands down, the pandemic taught people more
Right.
than they've learned in the last decade in 2 years.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, if you look at how this all played out, right? 2017, going into 18, ELDs, prices skyrocketed. 19, prices dropped. 20, pandemic, boom, everything happened. Things went haywire. As a logistics manager, as somebody who is literally my lifeline, is making sure my product cost of shipping or to get the product to market stays
Right.
in X window,
Yep.
right? I think they're sitting there saying, no, there's got to be a way better way, and let's explore it. And I think prior to even, call it 2017, 18, it was almost, most companies were never thinking about private fleet, because then they got to employ drivers and they got to do maintenance and they got to. But now it's one of these things where, like, are we willing to keep playing this yo-yo game, or do we want to control our costs to a point where we can get it down to the fraction of a penny to get product to market? And I think this is the route that a lot of companies are going to go. Now, there's some companies, that just would never be able to employ the fleet in order to get done what they need to get done. But if I don't know, I look at it and I say, I think customers, I think shippers, manufacturers have gotten a lot smarter, and now they've understood how much of an impact a volatile or haywire freight market can have on their bottom line.
Right.
I really think the biggest lesson in COVID was that. And the biggest lesson in COVID for a lot of companies, the secondary lesson was, we do not need 3,000 people in this building.
Right. Right.
I think those two lessons are paramount when we're talking about, like, what's the timeline that got us to here. And I don't mean to keep talking about COVID, Dean, but the fact is that what happens, our past leads us to today, right? So things that happen in our past create the future for us when we say, okay, we're now going to take control of this, right? And I look at it from a salesperson's point of view. The salespeople that took control of the market and had the conversations with their
Right.
customers, salespeople I've spoke to that always, since the beginning of COVID, have done cost plus, literally showed the invoice to their customer plus a percentage for themselves, and were not gouging, are skyrocketing right now.
Yeah, of course. It's like these ludicrous discussions about price floors. On the flip side, shippers would want price ceilings, right? Which is essentially what cost plus is. I've worked those contracts where you say, here's what my costs are, here's my margin, let's work together on it. But if you work in the volatile side of the market where there's excessive demand and you need to move things, that worked well in the pandemic. But for now, I think we're seeing a market rationalize itself. Like, I think there's a real clean out going on both the carrier and the broker side. Unfortunately, it means that, a lot of people are no longer in business, and that's the nature of a free market that we work in. It's the same in all the free markets the world over.
I agree.
So that's the news for the week, Dan.
Sweet.